Is Putin getting more desperate to recruit Russians to send to their deaths in Ukraine? Just how is he incentivizing Russians to put their lives on the line? And is Ukraine still saying we're not willing to give up any of our turf? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so this is an interesting story from the Kiev Independent, indicating that Moscow is willing to pay its residents over $21,000 in signing bonuses for joining the army. Now, you may know that within Russia, with some purchasing power parity adjustments, you're looking at around something like $100,000 bonus. And believe it or not, that's not unprecedented. The U.S. Army in the early 2000s, particularly around 2006, 7, 8 timeframe, offered comparably high bonuses, I think up to $45,000. For signing up for some of the most dangerous jobs, things like fuel hauling in Iraq. But crucially, the casualty rates in Iraq never even approached that of the Ukraine conflict. And so, but we already know that the Russian government is in a tight spot. So what's interesting is that this is actually a local bonus signed by the Moscow mayor, establishing a one-time signing bonus of $21,000 for city residents who join the military. And it makes sense that a country as large as Russia is going to sort of regionally adjust its military bonuses. That's because, of course, if you live in an impoverished area like Tuva or Krasnohor Krai, you're going to need cost of living is just way lower. So you're going to need a smaller bonus to get the same level of incentive for joining. Now, as we've talked about, Moscow has a lot of cosmopolitan internationalist thinking in terms of their population. They're very, very unlikely to sign up for this conflict. So I think this is mostly just symbolic or perfunctory. The real areas that are drawing in the latest troops are likely places like Krasnohor Krai, Dagestan, Tuva, and other impoverished areas with a lot of ethnic minorities. That's been who is most likely to join up for this Russian war effort, in addition, of course, with prisoners. Now, a Moscow resident who enlists in the army, if they live long enough, will make over $60,000 over the course of their first year in service. Servicemen will also receive a one-time $5,000 to $10,000 bonus for being injured, and a family of a soldier killed in action is purportedly given $34,000. Now, as we've talked about, average monthly wage across Russia is around $700. So what I find most interesting about this is that the numbers are so very high and that they're rising. And that, again, while we don't have insight, we can't get insight into the actual numbers of the Russian recruitment effort, what we can garner is some insight into the situation, the recruitment efforts through these kind of secondary metrics. Again, you can see how much more desperate the Russians are to generate troops based on these payouts. And the fact that we're looking at payouts that are, something like 25 times the average monthly salary in Russia, you're seeing how incredibly desperate the Russian regime is to keep these troops going in. And as we've talked about on this channel extensively, the Russian military has basically a pretty simple playbook. It needs to bring in about 25,000 soldiers a month because that's about how many it's losing in Ukraine every month. And Russia's mentality is as long as they don't have a net loss in soldiers, they are able to sustain this level of combat operation. Now, before we talk a little bit about the actual combat operations that Russia's embarking on, I wanted to quick talk about where you can get the combat footage. And I can't show you combat footage on YouTube, but there's so much drone footage, GoPro footage of the fighting on both sides. And we take a look at that over on combatvetnews.com. If you want to help keep me independent and not beholden to big tech or a big media company, then you can support me over on Combat Vet News. Of course, Specialist tier is going to get you access to those twice a month uncensored combat videos. The one we just took a look at is actually a 7-minute assault of a Russian trench line by what is probably one of the most elite light infantry soldiers I've ever seen. Just totally aware, absolutely decisive, just confidently able to think ahead. Really, the guy is like something. It's not even like something out of a video game, because he's smarter than any video game would be, right? And it's a sign, of course, that Ukraine, because they take fewer casualties, can accrue soldiers with a lot of elite experience, whereas Russia, who simply has this high attrition rate, never really gets these elite experienced soldiers. So if you're interested in getting a look at that footage, or you want to participate in the weekly Q&As, or even get the shout-outs, lieutenant tier or the colonel tier are even better ways to support the channel. And I appreciate all you guys over there on combatvetnews.com that support me, so you should go check it out and sign up today. The link is in the description. Okay, so I wanted to point out why I think Russia has this tremendous problem. The first is this chart from The Economist. This is Russian soldiers killed per week in Ukraine. And as you can see, that there was actually a lull in 2022. The Ukrainian counteroffensive, some of the Russian defensive efforts as Ukraine liberated places like Kharkiv and Kherson rose this. There was some level of Russian counterattack. In 2023, you can see the Ukrainian counteroffensive launched, and Russia actually took far fewer casualties because they weren't focused on offensive operations. They were focused on the defense. And then as Russia has pivoted to the offense, you can see the more they have gone into an offensive posture, the higher their casualties are. And you can see really here in 2024, it's been devastating, right? The 2024 opening up with the Battle of Avdiivka, where, yes, Russian forces seized Avdiivka, but at an absolutely eye-popping cost. You could see also the premature Russian attack in Kharkiv, also incurring massive, massive spikes of casualties. And so all this to say, again, Putin believes that he can, it seems like, indefinitely generate 25,000 plus troops to fight these fights. But again, when you're talking about weekly losses, right, of over 1,000 troops, and these are killed. Remember, for every one soldier killed, you can expect about 4 who are wounded so badly that they cannot continue to serve in the military. So you are really looking at a burn rate that is at the limit of what someone like Putin and the Russian economy can sustain. But what do they gain for it? That's the other thing that I find kind of interesting. You can see that Russian strategy is simply to launch human wave attacks. And you can see that in a typical day, these attacks will garner almost no measurable territory, right? You could see in the grand scheme of things, you literally cannot see the difference here. And this isn't even the entire front line, right? So when you zoom out to the front line, you can see that in a given day, Russian forces making no detectable gains. Only when you zoom in, you realize that, again, hundreds of Russian soldiers given their lives to seize what looks like maybe a building or two here in Prishtine. You also, of course, may see Russian forces seize, let's see what this looks like right here. You can see they've seized, again, a street, about approximately, let's see, the street that they've seized is approximately 494 meters, something that you and I could probably lightly jog in less than a minute. And of course, empty farm fields. Can't forget the Russian priority of seizing empty farm fields. And so all these things, of course, are part of a Ukrainian strategy that says that, listen, if it's not really valuable terrain, yield it. Force the Russians to leave their bunkers and expose themselves to fire, where Ukrainian drones will tear them to pieces. And if the Russians do occupy something of value, the Ukrainians choose to launch localized strategic counterattacks to push them out. This is a very effective strategy at killing Russians, and that at this point is the Ukrainian priority. The Ukrainian priority is simply to run Putin out of able-bodied people. And the fact is that there are a bunch of hints that it's happening, right? We've talked about the way the Russian war spending has crushed the Russian economy, but when you see this too, right, these rising incentives, it means that they risk entering a sort of dangerous personnel cost spiral, in which you have to pay each soldier more because there are fewer people willing to sign up. that increases the war's total expenses, driving up inflation, meaning that to get the next round of soldiers in a now inflated Russian economy, Russia has to spend even more money. Because remember, you know what's not hyperinflating is the price of oil. Russia is still selling its oil for the exact same amount it always does, but the spiral upward of prices risks really crushing the Russian economy. And again, every time there's fewer and fewer people that sign on the dotted line, you've got to just offer more and more money. And that is the thing that is at risk of at some point, there will not be more troops for Russia to fight, right? They'll either have to start drafting people by force, or they will have to pivot to a strategy that simply doesn't involve tens of thousands of soldiers killed every single month. But that would mean that Russia wouldn't make any advances in the battlefield at all. And if that were the case, again, you would risk pivoting the offensive football, so to speak, to the Ukrainians, or Russia would simply have to finally come to the negotiating table with conditions as they are, recognizing that it's unable to continue the fight. Now, what's interesting is there's also polling data from Ukrainians who said that the majority of Ukrainians don't want to give up any territory to achieve peace, right? This is from what's more interesting is that the number of Ukrainians opposed to territorial concessions to Russia in exchange for peace is on the downslide, right? 55% of Ukrainians say, no, don't give the Russians a single inch of land. But in 2023, that number was 74% were opposed. And remember, December 2023, things were still pretty rough for the Ukrainians. The counteroffensive had failed. The Battle of Avdiivka was going poorly. There was no sign that U.S. aid was coming, and yet still 74% of folks said they didn't want to yield any of their territory. But there's an increasing sense of realism. And again, if that means yielding a small amount of territory to achieve peace and independence, right? But that could be as little as 1 square foot of Crimea, right? So, you're not talking about some kind of decisive feelings. Of course, it makes sense that the highest level of opposition to giving Russia territory is in the West, where the war is pretty distant, and the lowest is in the South, where the war is literally a reality of every single day. And once the country's gone 2 years without occupying that territory, without having control over the occupied regions, they increasingly might say, listen, we may not need this, right? We may not need these parts of our country, not if it's draining us of our, forcing us into this constant war footing, right? Now, to be clear, this is not the same thing as Ukrainians want to sue for peace or are opposed to fighting. It simply means that when it comes time to sit at the negotiating table, more Ukrainians are willing to stomach some level of territorial concession, right? And as we know, the different presidential candidates in the United States have very different perspectives of how Ukraine could do this, right? President Trump has been much more proximate to saying that Ukraine may have to yield some territory, whereas Vice President Harris has said, no, Ukraine doesn't have to give up its territory. Russia can be beaten on the battlefield, even if the Russians aren't ejected militarily from Ukrainian territory. Again, putting the squeeze on Putin and his economy hard enough will force Putin to sit there and make some otherwise unthinkable concessions. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. A huge thank you to the Colonel tier members of CombatVetNews.com, including James Sterling, Steve Moran, Doug Beck, Alan Knutson, Bastian Hemmerling, Yanko Georgiev, and all the members, as well as all our Lieutenant tier members. Could not do this without you guys. You guys really are the ones who carry this whole thing. Be sure to join us over on CombatVetNews.com. Link is in the description. You can also, of course, subscribe to the channel and like the video. Those things are free. I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.